The room was a cocoon of shadows, the only light a faint glow from the heart monitor beside the bed. It was 2:14 a.m., and the air in the penthouse was thick with the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy with dread. James Carver, billionaire tech mogul, stood frozen at the foot of his daughter's bed, his tailored suit rumpled, his face a mask of exhaustion and fear. Little Sophie, barely 7, lay pale against the pillows, her small body trembling with fever, her breaths shallow and ragged. The private nurse hovered nearby, her hands wringing, useless against the storm raging in Sophie's fragile frame. James had seen empires rise and fall, had stared down boardrooms and broken men with a glance, but here, in this moment, he was powerless, a king stripped of his crown. The monitor beeped, a cruel metronome, and Sophie stirred, her eyelids fluttering like moth wings. Her voice, faint as a whisper in a gale, cut through the silence. "Miss Emma," she rasped, her tiny hand clutching the air as if reaching for someone who wasn't there. James's heart lurched. He stepped closer, his polished shoes silent on the hardwood, his breath catching as he leaned over her. "Sophie, sweetheart, I'm here," he said, his voice cracking, but her eyes, glazed with fever, looked past him, searching for a ghost. "Miss Emma," she whispered again, and the name was a blade, slicing through the room's fragile calm. The nurse glanced at James, her face pale, but he barely noticed. His mind raced, grasping for meaning. Miss Emma? The nanny who'd left months ago. The woman who'd cared for Sophie, who'd braided her hair and read her stories, who'd been nothing more than a quiet presence in their gilded lives. Why her? Why now, when Sophie was teetering on the edge, her fever spiking despite the doctor's promises? James's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He turned to the nurse, his voice low, dangerous. "Get Emma. Now." The nurse hesitated, her lips parting, but his glare silenced her. She nodded and hurried out, leaving him alone with his daughter's fading voice. He sank into the chair beside Sophie's bed, his eyes locked on her face, so small, so like her mother's, a mother who'd vanished into the haze of addiction years ago, leaving James to raise Sophie alone. He'd given her everything, the best schools, the finest doctors, a world of wealth to shield her from pain. But wealth couldn't stop this fever, couldn't stop her calling for a woman he barely remembered. Emma. Her face flickered in his mind, soft brown eyes, a quiet smile, hands that moved with gentle precision. She'd been good with Sophie, hadn't she? But she'd left, abruptly, without explanation, and he'd let her go, too consumed by his empire to care. Now, her name was the only thing anchoring his daughter to this world, and he didn't know why. The door creaked open, and the nurse returned, her face tight with unease. "Sir, I couldn't reach her. Emma's number is disconnected. No one knows where she is." James's jaw tightened, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "Find her," he snapped, his voice a whip. "I don't care what it takes. Get her here." The nurse nodded, retreating, but the weight of her words settled like ash. Emma was gone, and Sophie's whispers were growing weaker, each one a plea James couldn't answer. He reached for Sophie's hand, so small in his, and pressed it to his lips, his vision blurring. "Hold on, baby," he murmured. "I'll find her. I'll bring her back." But the truth was clawing at him, a shadow he couldn't outrun. Emma wasn't just a nanny. She was something more, something he'd overlooked, something tied to Sophie in ways he couldn't yet grasp. The clock ticked, each second a hammer against his resolve. He stood, pacing the room, his mind spiraling. 6 months ago, Emma had been here, in this very penthouse, her laughter mingling with Sophie's. 6 months ago, he'd barely noticed her, too busy closing deals, chasing power. Now, her absence was a void, and Sophie's life hung in the balance. What had he missed? What had Sophie seen in Emma that he hadn't? He stopped by the window, the city sprawling below, its lights indifferent to his daughter's struggle. His reflection stared back, a man who'd built a fortune but couldn't save the one thing that mattered. Sophie's voice echoed in his head, asterisk Miss Emma asterisk, and with it came a memory, faint but sharp. A night, months ago, when he'd come home late, the penthouse quiet. Emma had been in the living room, asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest, Sophie curled beside her, safe, peaceful. He'd paused, just for a moment, struck by the scene, by the warmth he hadn't felt in years. He'd turned away, dismissing it, but now that moment burned, a clue he'd ignored. The phone rang, jarring him back. The nurse's voice was hesitant. "Sir, we found an address, but it's old. She might not be there." James didn't hesitate. "Send it to me. I'm going." He grabbed his coat, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he'd find, didn't know if Emma was the key to saving Sophie or just a desperate hope. But as he stepped into the elevator, the city's hum fading behind him, one thing was clear, Emma held answers, and he'd tear the world apart to get them. The address was a rundown apartment building on the city's edge, its walls stained with time, its halls smelling of damp and despair. James climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing, his mind racing. He knocked on the door, his fist heavy, but no one answered. He knocked again, louder, desperation creeping in. A neighbor peeked out, an older woman with wary eyes. "You looking for Emma?" she asked, her voice rough. James nodded, his throat tight. "She's gone," the woman said, shaking her head. "Left months ago. Didn't say where." His stomach dropped. "Do you know why?" he asked, his voice raw. The woman hesitated, then sighed. She was heartbroken. Something about a little girl she loved like her own. The words hit like a fist. James stumbled back, the hallway tilting. Heartbroken. A little girl. Sophie. He thanked the woman, his voice hollow, and made his way to the street, the city blurring around him. He pulled out his phone, dialing the nurse again, demanding more leads, but his hands were shaking. Sophie's fever, her whispers, Emma's absence, it was all connected, a puzzle he'd been too blind to see. He drove back to the penthouse, the photo of Sophie and Emma from months ago now clutched in his hand, their smiles haunting him. He didn't know where Emma was, but he knew one thing, she wasn't just a nanny. She was the piece he'd been missing, and Sophie's life depended on finding her. As he re-entered Sophie's room, the monitor's beep was slower now, each pause a knife in his chest. He sat beside her, his voice trembling. "I'm trying, Sophie. I'm trying to find her." But her eyes were closed, her whispers gone, and the silence was louder than ever. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his failures crashing down. 6 months ago, he'd let Emma walk away. 6 months ago, he'd ignored the bond between her and Sophie. Now, he was paying the price, and the clock was running out. 6 months earlier, the city was a different beast, its pulse quickened by the promise of spring. The penthouse, perched high above the chaos, was a fortress of glass and steel, but inside, it hummed with a softer rhythm. Emma Grayson moved through its halls with quiet purpose, her sneakers silent on the marble floors, her arms full of Sophie's books and toys. She was 26, her brown eyes sharp with a resilience born of years scraping by, her smile a shield against the world's sharp edges. To James Carver, she was just the nanny, a temporary fixture, a name on a payroll. But to Sophie, she was everything, a storyteller, a protector, a light in the sterile glow of their wealth. Emma had come to the Carver household by chance, a job taken to pay off her mother's lingering medical debts. She'd expected coldness, the kind of detachment that came with wealth, but Sophie had surprised her. The girl was a spark, all wide eyes and endless questions, her laughter filling rooms that felt too big, too empty. Emma spent her days with Sophie, reading under the living room's vast windows, weaving tales of dragons and faraway stars. She'd braid Sophie's hair, her fingers gentle, and when the girl fell asleep against her, Emma's heart would ache with a love she hadn't planned for. She wasn't Sophie's mother, but in those moments, she felt like she could be. James was a shadow in their world, a man who existed in boardrooms and late-night calls, his presence rare and fleeting. When he was home, he was distracted, his eyes on his phone, his voice clipped. Emma didn't mind. She wasn't here for him. But sometimes, she'd catch him watching, not her, but Sophie, his face softening for a moment before the mask returned. He was a man carrying a weight she couldn't name, and she didn't try to. Her job was Sophie, and Sophie was enough. One evening, as the city glowed amber beyond the penthouse, Emma sat on the living room floor, Sophie sprawled beside her, coloring a picture of a campfire. "Miss Emma, have you ever seen a real one?" Sophie asked, her pencil pausing. Emma smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Once, when I was little. My mom took me camping. The flames danced, and the stars felt so close you could touch them." Sophie's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. "I want to see that someday. With you." Emma's chest tightened, a warmth spreading through her. "Someday, sweet girl," she said, her voice soft. "We'll make it happen." The door opened, and James stepped in, his suit impeccable, his face etched with fatigue. Emma glanced up, expecting him to pass through, but he paused, his gaze lingering on the scene. Sophie ran to him, holding up her drawing. "Daddy, look. It's a campfire for me and Miss Emma." James knelt, his smile strained but genuine. "It's beautiful, Sophie," he said, his voice quieter than usual. His eyes flicked to Emma, and for a moment, something passed between them, not attraction, not yet, but a shared recognition of Sophie's light. Emma looked away, her cheeks warm, and busied herself with the crayons. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Emma lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes she didn't need to. James appeared, loosening his tie, his presence filling the room. "You're good with her," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. Emma dried her hands, surprised. "She makes it easy," she replied, meeting his gaze. His eyes were piercing, but there was a crack in his armor, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "She doesn't trust many people," he said, his tone heavy. "Her mother, she left us. It's been hard." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "Sophie's strong. She just needs someone to see it." He studied her, as if seeing her for the first time, then nodded. "Thank you, Emma." The moment lingered, fragile, unspoken. Over the weeks, it grew. Small conversations in passing, shared glances when Sophie laughed, moments that felt like threads weaving something new. Emma noticed the way James's shoulders relaxed when he watched Sophie with her, the way his voice softened when he said her name. She told herself it was nothing, that she was reading too much into it. She was the nanny, nothing more. But when he'd brush past her in the hall, his hand grazing hers, her heart would stutter, and she'd curse herself for it. One night, after a gala James had to attend, he came home late, his tie undone, his eyes heavy with something darker than fatigue. Emma was in the living room, folding Sophie's blanket, the penthouse quiet. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone light. He leaned against the doorframe, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You could say that." He paused, then added, "You're still here. You don't have to be." She shrugged, tucking the blanket away. "Sophie had a nightmare. I wanted to make sure she was okay." His smile faded, replaced by something raw. "You're more than she deserves," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's breath caught. She should have left, should have said goodnight, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice soft. "She deserves you, too, you know. You're her whole world." James looked at her, his eyes searching, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. He reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist, and the touch was electric, a spark in the quiet. "Emma," he said, her name a question, a confession. She froze, her heart pounding, but before either could speak, Sophie's voice called from her room, small and scared. Emma pulled away, the moment shattering, and hurried to Sophie, her cheeks burning. After that, something shifted. James lingered more, his presence warmer, his words carrying a weight they hadn't before. Emma felt it, the pull between them, but she fought it. He was her employer, a man whose world was galaxies from hers. She was a nanny, a woman with debts and dreams too small for his orbit. But Sophie bound them, her love for Emma a bridge James seemed to cross without realizing. Emma wondered if he felt it, too, the spark, the possibility, but she never asked. She couldn't afford to. Then, one morning, everything changed. Emma arrived at the penthouse, her bag slung over her shoulder, only to find James waiting, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold, formal. Her stomach dropped. "Is Sophie okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "She's fine. But I think, it's time we part ways." The words were a slap, sharp and sudden. Emma stared, her mind reeling. "What? Why?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "It's for the best. I've arranged severance. You'll be fine." She tried to argue, to ask for a reason, but his walls were up, impenetrable. She left that day, her heart in pieces, Sophie's laughter echoing in her ears. As she walked away, the city swallowing her, Emma clutched the small bracelet Sophie had made for her, its beads digging into her palm. She didn't understand why James had pushed her away, didn't know what she'd done. But she knew one thing, Sophie was her heart, and leaving her felt like losing a piece of her soul. She didn't know then that 6 months later, Sophie's fevered whispers would call her back, or that the truth would unravel everything. The city was a labyrinth of rain and regret, its streets slick with the weight of forgotten promises. 8 years ago, Emma Grayson was 18, a girl with dreams too big for the small town she'd left behind. She'd come to the city with a suitcase and a heart full of hope, chasing a life where she could be more than her mother's shadow. But hope was a fragile thing, and the city was a beast that chewed it up. She found work as a waitress, then a cleaner, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her nights spent in a cramped apartment that smelled of mildew. She was invisible, a speck in the city's churn, until the night she met James Carver, and everything changed. It was a charity gala, one of those glittering affairs where wealth wore a mask of generosity. Emma was there as a server, her black uniform stiff, her tray heavy with champagne flutes. She moved through the crowd, her head down, her heart pounding with the fear of spilling something, of drawing attention. James was a star in that room, his presence commanding, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. He was 30, already a titan in tech, his name whispered with awe. Emma didn't know him, didn't care to. Men like him were a different species, untouchable, unreachable. But fate, or chance, had other plans. She tripped, just a small stumble, but it was enough. A glass tipped, champagne splashing onto the polished floor, and the room seemed to hold its breath. She froze, her cheeks burning, waiting for the laughter, the scorn. Instead, a hand steadied her tray, strong and sure. She looked up, and there was James, his eyes not mocking but kind, his voice low. "Easy," he said, his smile softer than she'd expected. She mumbled a thank you, her heart racing, and slipped back into the crowd, but his gaze followed her, a weight she couldn't shake. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like James didn't notice girls like her. But later that night, as she left the venue, her coat thin against the rain, a car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and there he was, his tie loosened, his face lit by the dashboard's glow. "Need a ride?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes held something else, curiosity, maybe, or something deeper. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to walk away, but the rain was cold, and his smile was warm. "Okay," she said, sliding into the passenger seat, her wet shoes squeaking against the leather. The ride was quiet at first, the city blurring past, its lights smudged by the rain. He asked her name, and she gave it, her voice small. Emma. He repeated it, like he was tasting it, and she felt a flush creep up her neck. They talked, or rather, she did, surprised by how easy it was. She told him about her mother, sick and fading back home, about her dreams of studying art, of painting the stars she'd loved as a child. He listened, really listened, his eyes on her instead of the road, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. That night was the beginning, a spark in the dark. They met again, by chance or design, she never knew. Coffee shops, late-night walks, moments stolen from his world of power and her world of struggle. He was different with her, unguarded, his laughter real, his stories laced with a loneliness she recognized. She saw the man behind the myth, the one who'd lost his parents young, who'd built an empire to fill the void. He saw her, too, not the waitress, not the cleaner, but the girl who painted with words, who carried light despite the weight of her life. They fell, not fast, but deep. He'd take her to his penthouse, not to impress but to share, showing her the city from his windows, its lights a canvas for her dreams. She'd tease him, calling him Mr. Big Shot, and he'd laugh, pulling her close, his hands warm against her skin. One night, under a sky heavy with stars, he gave her a bracelet, a simple thing woven from thread, not gold. "For you," he said, tying it around her wrist. "So you'll remember me when you're famous." She laughed, but her heart ached. She wore it every day, even when it frayed. But love, like hope, was fragile. James's world was a machine, its gears grinding anything soft. His days grew longer, his calls shorter, his eyes shadowed by pressures she couldn't touch. She felt him slipping, not from her heart but from her reach. One night, she faced him, her voice steady despite the tremble in her chest. "If you're letting go, just say it." He looked at her, his face a storm of guilt and fear, and said, "I can't do this, Emma. Not now." The words were a knife, clean and deep. She nodded, her throat tight, and left, the bracelet burning against her skin. She didn't cry until she was alone, in her apartment, the city's hum mocking her pain. She told herself it was better this way. Men like James didn't stay, and girls like her didn't get forever. But weeks later, when the nausea came, when the test showed 2 lines, she sat on her bathroom floor, the bracelet a weight she couldn't bear. She tried to call him, once, twice, but his number was disconnected, his world closed to her. She was alone, and the child growing inside her was a secret she'd carry in silence. Emma left the city soon after, returning to her small town, where the air was clean and the stars were bright. She named her daughter Sophie, after her mother, and poured every ounce of love into her. The bracelet stayed on, a reminder of a man she'd loved and lost. She worked as a teacher's aide, her hands stained with chalk, her life small but steady. Sophie grew, her eyes the same shade as James's, her laugh a melody Emma clung to. She thought she'd buried the past, but 8 years later, a fever would unearth it, and Sophie's whispers would shatter the walls she'd built. The rain had stopped, leaving the city draped in a quiet sheen, its lights softened by the dawn. James Carver stood outside a small daycare in a forgotten corner of the city, his coat damp, his heart a knot of hope and dread. It had been 3 days since Sophie's fever broke, 3 days since the doctors called it a miracle, her small body fighting back against the odds. But James hadn't slept, hadn't returned to his boardroom. Sophie's whispers, Miss Emma had become his compass, guiding him through a maze of guilt and revelation. He'd torn through records, hired investigators, chased every lead until one brought him here, to this modest building where children's laughter spilled through the open windows. He'd learned the truth, piece by jagged piece. Emma wasn't just the nanny. She was Sophie's mother, the woman he'd loved and lost 8 years ago, the one he'd pushed away in a haze of ambition and fear. The bracelet on her wrist, the one Sophie had clung to in her fevered dreams, was the same one he'd given her under a starlit sky. Sophie was his daughter, not just in name but in blood, a truth Emma had hidden to protect her from a world that broke her once. James had fired Emma 6 months ago, not because she'd failed, but because he'd felt the pull of her presence, a threat to the walls he'd built around his heart. Now, those walls were rubble, and he was here to face what he'd destroyed. He hesitated at the daycare's gate, his breath uneven. Inside, he could see her, Emma, her hair tied back, her hands guiding a group of children through a game. She was different now, her face etched with a quiet strength, but her eyes were the same, warm and steady, the ones that had once looked at him like he was enough. He didn't deserve those eyes, not after what he'd done, but Sophie's voice echoed in his mind, and he knew he couldn't walk away. Not again. The bell rang, and children streamed out, their voices a bright chaos. Emma followed, her gaze scanning the crowd, and then it landed on him. Her body stilled, her expression a mix of shock and wariness, like a deer caught in a hunter's sight. James stepped forward, his hands raised, a silent plea. "Emma," he said, his voice rough, barely audible over the chatter. She didn't move, her arms crossing, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, guarded, but it trembled, betraying the storm beneath. He took a breath, the weight of 8 years pressing against his chest. "I know," he said, the words heavy, final. "About Sophie. About you. About everything." Her face paled, her lips parting, but she didn't speak. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "I didn't know, Emma. I swear, I didn't know she was ours." Her eyes flashed, a spark of anger cutting through the pain. "You didn't want to know," she said, her voice sharp. "You pushed me away. Twice. You don't get to claim her now because you're sorry." The words were a blade, and he took them, every one. "You're right," he said, his voice raw. "I was a coward. I built an empire to hide from what I felt, from you, from her. But I'm here now, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Emma's gaze wavered, her hands clenching, and for a moment, he thought she'd turn away. But then a small voice broke the silence. "Miss Emma." Sophie ran from the daycare, her braid bouncing, her face alight with joy. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she saw James. "Daddy." The word was a miracle, a wound, a bridge. Sophie ran to him, her arms wrapping around his legs, and he knelt, pulling her close, his eyes burning. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick. He looked up at Emma, who stood frozen, tears glistening in her eyes. Sophie turned to her, confused but bright. "Miss Emma, you know Daddy." The question was innocent, but it cracked the air, a truth too big for the moment. Emma knelt beside Sophie, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder. "Yeah, sweet girl," she said, her voice trembling. "I know him." Her eyes met James's, and in them, he saw everything, 8 years of pain, of love, of a mother's fierce devotion. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the frayed bracelet he'd found in Sophie's room, the one she'd clutched during her fever. "This was yours," he said, holding it out. "I gave it to you. And you gave me her." His voice broke, and he pressed the bracelet into her hand, his fingers brushing hers, a spark in the quiet. Emma took it, her fingers trembling, and for a moment, she was 18 again, standing under the stars with a man who'd promised her forever. She looked at Sophie, then at James, and the anger in her softened, not gone but tempered by something new, hope, maybe, or the ghost of what they'd been. "I didn't keep her from you to hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kept her safe. From your world, from us." He nodded, his throat tight. "I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can be part of hers. If you'll let me." Sophie tugged at Emma's sleeve, her eyes bright. "Can Daddy come to the campfire with us?" The question was a spark, a memory of a promise Emma had made months ago, a dream of stars and warmth. Emma's lips curved, a small, reluctant smile. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft, her eyes still on James. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door, cracked open, letting in light. They stood there, the three of them, in the daycare's small yard, the city humming around them, indifferent to their fragile reunion. James took Sophie's hand, and Emma didn't pull away. They walked toward the gate, Sophie chattering about stars, her voice a melody that bound them. The bracelet hung from Emma's wrist, its threads worn but unbroken, a reminder of a love that had faltered but never died. James didn't know if they'd be a family, didn't know if Emma would ever trust him again. But as they stepped into the dawn, he knew one thing: he'd never stop trying. The city stretched before them, its lights fading in the morning glow, and for the first time in years, James felt something like peace. Sophie's hand was warm in his, Emma's presence a quiet strength beside him. The past was a scar, but the future was a canvas, and they'd paint it together, one careful stroke at a time.